The year 553 after Christ. Constantinople. 164 bishops gather in the great conciliar hall. The emperor watches. The pope is under arrest. And at the center of it all, the accused. Only the accused had already been dead for 125 years. His name was Theodore of Mopsuestia. In life, he was called a genius, the greatest Bible scholar the Christian East had ever produced. Entire churches repeated his name with reverence. Emperors bowed before his sermons. His method of reading the scriptures was so revolutionary that an entire tradition simply called him the interpreter, no surname required. But on that day, in 553, none of that mattered, because an emperor decided that the theology of a dead man was too dangerous to be allowed to survive, and if the man himself could no longer be imprisoned, tried, or executed, then everything he left behind would be destroyed. Every manuscript, every commentary, every prayer he composed, all of it. This is the story of how the greatest biblical scholar of Christian antiquity was transformed into a heretic, not because of something he did in life, but because of a political decision made more than a century after his death. A story about faith, imperial power, and the invisible line that separates a saint from a heretic. And the most disturbing part? Depending on which church you attend today, he is still one or the other. To understand how a dead man ended up in the dock of an ecumenical council, we must go back in time, long before Constantinople, long before Emperor Justinian, long before any accusation. We must return to the 4th century, to the heart of a city that, at the time, rivaled Rome and Alexandria for the title of intellectual capital of Christianity, Antioch. Today, the ruins of Antioch lie in the province of Hatay, in southern Turkey, near the Syrian border. But in that era, Antioch was a vibrant metropolis, the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire, with 500,000 inhabitants, trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to Persia, and a Christian community so ancient that it was there, according to the Book of Acts, that the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. And it was there that 2 things were born that would change the history of theology forever: a school of thought and a man. The school was the school of Antioch. The man was Theodore. But before speaking of him, the stage must be understood. 4th century Christianity was not a unified religion with fully settled doctrine. It was a theological battlefield. Each great city had its own school, its own tradition, its own way of reading the Bible, and all of them competed fiercely with one another. On one side, Alexandria, the school founded by Clement and raised by Origen to an unprecedented intellectual height. For the Alexandrians, the biblical text was a veil. Behind every narrative, every psalm, every prophecy, there was a hidden spiritual meaning, an allegory that only the trained eyes of faith could perceive. Adam was not merely Adam. The Exodus was not merely an escape from Egypt. Everything pointed to Christ. Everything concealed a higher truth. It was an elegant, sophisticated method, and to its critics, dangerously subjective. On the other side, Antioch, a school that looked at the same text and said, before searching for what is hidden, understand what is written. The historical context matters. The human author matters. Grammar matters. The literal meaning is not inferior to the spiritual. It is the foundation without which interpretation becomes fantasy. For the Antiochenes, uncontrolled allegory was an open door to making the Bible say whatever the interpreter wished. This clash, allegorical interpretation versus literal interpretation, Alexandria versus Antioch, was not an innocent academic dispute. It was a war of world views, a war that would define councils, depose patriarchs, divide empires, and, as we shall see, destroy the reputation of a man 125 years after his death. The intellectual founder of the Antiochene tradition was Diodore of Tarsus, a monk, ascetic, and teacher who directed a kind of theological school on the outskirts of Antioch. Diodore was no ordinary thinker. He confronted the Arian emperor Valens head-on, defended Nicene orthodoxy when doing so could cost a man his life, and trained an entire generation of bishops and theologians. Two of his students would become giants in Christian history. The first, John Chrysostom, the future patriarch of Constantinople, the greatest preacher the ancient church ever heard, a man whose eloquence earned him the nickname golden-mouthed. The second, Theodore of Mopsuestia. Both studied together, both were formed by the same master, both absorbed the same method, but their destinies would be radically different. Chrysostom would become a saint in virtually every Christian tradition. Theodore would be erased from history. And it all began in the same classroom, in the same city, under the same teacher. The stage was set, the pieces were in motion, and the young Theodore, brilliant, ambitious, the son of a wealthy family in Antioch, had no idea that every word he would write, every biblical commentary he would produce, every prayer he would compose, would one day be used as evidence against him, in a trial at which he could never appear. Theodore was born around the year 350 in Antioch, into a family belonging to the city's civil elite. His father held an administrative post, likely tied to the Roman provincial bureaucracy, and the family had enough resources to secure their children the finest education available in the ancient world. His brother, Polychronius, would pursue an ecclesiastical career and become Bishop of Apamea, one of the most important cities in Roman Syria. The two brothers grew up in an environment where politics, religion, and classical culture were woven together like threads of the same tapestry. The Antioch in which Theodore grew up was not merely a Christian center. It was cosmopolitan in the deepest sense of the word. Pagans, Jews, and Christians lived side by side, not always in peace, but always in close proximity. Synagogues operated just a few blocks from basilicas. Neoplatonic philosophers taught alongside Christian rhetoricians. The Jewish community of Antioch was one of the oldest and most influential in the diaspora, and its methods of reading the scriptures, what the rabbis called peshat, the search for the text's direct and contextual meaning, circulated in the same intellectual atmosphere in which the young Theodore was formed. This proximity was not accidental. It would leave deep marks on the way Theodore would read the Bible for the rest of his life. Before entering Diodore's theological school, Theodore studied rhetoric and philosophy under one of the greatest teachers in the Roman world, Libanius. That name may not mean much today, but in the 4th century, Libanius was an intellectual celebrity, a devoted pagan, a master of oratory, a correspondent of emperors. His lectures were sought after by the elite across the entire East, and it was in those classrooms that Theodore sat beside the young John, who would later be known as Chrysostom. The two learned together the art of building arguments, dissecting texts, and persuading audiences. Libanius's rhetorical training was not theology, but it gave Theodore the intellectual tools he would use to revolutionize biblical exegesis. With a full classical education behind him, Theodore made a decision that would change his life. Instead of following the legal or administrative career his family expected, he entered Diodore of Tarsus's Asketerion, an ascetic community and theological school operating on the outskirts of Antioch, likely in a monastery connected to one of the city's churches. There, the study of scripture was the central occupation. This was not a seminary in the modern sense. It was total immersion. Prayer, fasting, exegetical reading, theological debate, all structured around a principle Diodore had established as the foundation of the school. The biblical text must first be read for what it says, before one goes searching for what it might mean. Diodore was a man of unshakable convictions. When the Arian emperor Valens persecuted Nicene Christians in the 370s, Diodore kept his community functioning underground, holding services outside the city walls to evade imperial repression. He paid for this with exile. But his resistance earned him immense prestige when Nicene orthodoxy triumphed under Theodosius I in 381. Diodore was appointed bishop of Tarsus, the city where the Apostle Paul was born, and he participated in the First Council of Constantinople as one of the most respected fathers of the assembly. It was under this master that Theodore absorbed not only an exegetical method, but an entire posture toward the sacred text. Diodore taught that there were three essential elements for interpreting any biblical passage. The theoria, the spiritual vision the text might contain, was only legitimate when anchored in the historia, the concrete historical sense of the narrative, and between the two stood the lexis, the careful analysis of language, grammar, and the author's chosen words. For Diodore, any allegorist who ignored history and grammar was not interpreting the Bible. He was inventing a new one. Theodore took that principle farther than any other disciple, much farther. But before that, there was a detour, a personal crisis that almost ended his theological career before it began. According to an early tradition, the young Theodore, likely between 18 and 20, abandoned Diodore's asceterion. The traditional explanation is that he became involved with a woman named Hermione and decided to leave monastic life in order to marry and pursue a secular career. His friend John Chrysostom, alarmed, is said to have written 2 passionate letters begging Theodore to return, texts known as Ad Theodorum Lapsum, to Theodore, the fallen. In these letters, Chrysostom uses striking images. He compares Theodore to a wounded soldier who has abandoned the battlefield, appeals to his calling, and reminds him of the beauty of the consecrated life. There is, however, a detail most retellings omit. Modern researchers connected to the Beth Mardutho Syriac Studies project point out that identifying the recipient of these letters as Theodore of Mopsuestia is uncertain. The attribution rests on fragile evidence and may have been promoted decades later by Theodore's adversaries, who had an interest in staining his reputation with a story of moral weakness and temporary apostasy. It is impossible to know for certain, but the story stuck. And as we will see, in the posthumous trial of 553, every negative detail would be used against him. What we can say with more confidence is that sometime between 383 and 386, Theodore was ordained a presbyter in Antioch, and from that point forward he began to write, and to write with an intensity that amazed everyone around him. His contemporaries gave him the nickname Polyhistor, the man of vast knowledge, because of the breadth of his commentaries. He did not confine himself to one book or one biblical genre. He tackled nearly the entire canon, the Psalms, Genesis, the Minor Prophets, the Gospel of John, Paul's epistles, the Nicene Creed, the sacraments. Every work revealed the same radical commitment to the text's historical and grammatical sense, and every work pushed him a little farther from the Alexandrian consensus that dominated Egypt and, increasingly, Constantinople. And then came the calling that would define the rest of his life. In 392, Theodore was consecrated bishop of Mopsuestia, a city on the plain of Cilicia, in what is now southeastern Turkey, on the banks of the Pyramos River. Mopsuestia was not a metropolis like Antioch or Alexandria. It was a mid-sized city of regional importance, a hub on the trade routes linking the Mediterranean coast to the Anatolian interior and to Mesopotamia. Its ruins, now known as Missis or Yakopanar, lie in Adana province, and Italian-Turkish archaeological excavations have been uncovering fascinating layers of occupation going back 3,000 years, including 4th century mosaics featuring one of the earliest depictions of Noah's Ark, from the very period when Theodore was preaching there. For a man of Theodore's intellectual stature, Mopsuestia could have looked like a demotion, but it was not. The diocese gave him stability, time, and freedom to do what he did best: study, write, and teach. And it was there, over the next 36 years, from 392 until his death in 428, that Theodore produced the monumental body of work that would make him the most influential exegete in Eastern Christianity. 36 years as bishop of a single city. No scandals, no depositions, No formal accusations of heresy. No council condemned him. No patriarch accused him. On the contrary, in 394, when Theodore preached at a synod in Constantinople, Emperor Theodosius I publicly declared that he had never encountered a teacher so extraordinary. John of Antioch, patriarch of the city where Theodore was born, testified that Theodore expounded the scriptures in all the churches of the East and was never accused by any of the Orthodox. In the churches that knew him, the cry was unanimous. We believe as Theodore believed. Long live the faith of Theodore, and yet, and here lies the paradox that makes this story so disturbing. This same man, celebrated by emperors, revered by entire churches, and never accused in life, would be dragged to the dock of an ecumenical council 125 years after he was buried. But that was still far off. In 392, the young Bishop of Mopsuestia was only beginning, and the ideas he would put on paper in the decades that followed would be brilliant, revolutionary, and in the eyes of his future enemies, unforgivable. For 36 years in Mopsuestia, Theodore wrote, and he wrote like few in the history of the ancient church. Commentary after commentary, treatise after treatise, homily after homily, an intellectual output so vast that his literary catalogue, compiled centuries later by the Metropolitan Abdisho of Nisibis, filled 41 volumes in Syriac. To put that in perspective, it is more than most of the Church Fathers produced across an entire lifetime, and Theodore did all of it while simultaneously governing a diocese, training clergy, celebrating liturgies, and facing the theological disputes of his age. But it was not only the volume that impressed, it was the method. Theodore developed an exegetical system of a sophistication with no parallel in 4th century Christianity, and one that in many respects anticipated forms of biblical criticism that would only become common 1400 years later. His method rested on 3 conceptual pillars, which he applied with surgical rigor to every passage of Scripture. The first was what he called hypothesis, the classification of each text's subject matter. Before interpreting a verse, Theodore asked, is this text moral, dogmatic, or historical? What is the central theme the human author is addressing? That simple question, one almost no one was asking at the time, forced the interpreter to respect literary genre before chasing theological meanings. The second pillar was prosopon, identifying the person or voice speaking in the text. In the Psalms, for instance, Theodore did not automatically assume David was speaking in every case. He asked, who is speaking here? Is it the psalmist in the first person? Is it God? Is it the people of Israel? Is it a later prophetic voice? This analysis of narrative voices within the text was revolutionary and infuriating to anyone who wanted to read every psalm as a direct prophecy about Christ. The third pillar was akoluthia, the logical and narrative sequence of the text. Theodore insisted that every passage must be read within the flow of the argument in which it was embedded. To tear a verse out of context in order to prove a theological point was to him a violation of the text, something Alexandrian allegorists did routinely, and something he considered intellectually dishonest. With these tools, Theodore went after the entire biblical canon, and his conclusions were, there is no other word, explosive.
Let us begin with the Psalms.
The dominant Christian tradition, shaped by the Alexandrian school, read virtually all 150 Psalms as messianic prophecies. Every mention of a king was Christ. Every suffering described pointed to the cross. Every victory celebrated was the resurrection. Origen and his heirs had built an entire edifice of Christological interpretation of the Psalms that, for most 4th century Christians, was simply the correct way to read these texts. Theodore looked at that edifice and said, no. Out of 150 Psalms, he recognized only 4, Psalms 2, 8, 45, and 110, as containing direct messianic prophecy. The rest, he argued, were historical compositions written in specific contexts: the Davidic monarchy, the Babylonian exile, the Maccabean period, the reign of Hezekiah. They had human authors with human intentions. They could contain theoria, a broader spiritual dimension, but only when that dimension was anchored in the original historical sense. Without that anchor, any messianic reading was a projection by the interpreter, not an intention of the text. For many in the Alexandrian tradition, this was more than an academic mistake. It was blasphemy. To reduce the Psalms to human historical compositions was, in their view, to remove Christ from the Scriptures, an attack on the very structure of the Christian faith. But Theodore did not stop with the Psalms. He turned his attention to the Song of Songs, the Shir HaShirim, and declared something few Christians dared to say out loud. The book was a secular love poem, written by Solomon, about Solomon and an Egyptian princess. No allegories about Christ and the Church, no bridal mysticism. A poem of human love, pure and simple. This reading was not unheard of in the ancient world. Jewish rabbis such as Rabbi Akiva had to defend the song's sacredness against those who treated it as a profane song in taverns. But in the Christian world, to say the Song of Songs was not an allegory of the relationship between Christ and his bride was practically unthinkable. Origen had written one of his most extensive and influential commentaries precisely on the song, turning it into a masterpiece of mystical exegesis. Theodore was saying that all of this was a construction with no grounding in the text. And he went further. Theodore questioned the canonicity of several biblical books. He raised doubts about Job, about Ezra, about the deuterocanonical books. He rejected the Catholic epistles, except for 1 Peter and 1 John, and he showed skepticism toward the Apocalypse of John. His position on the canon was notably more restrictive than that of most of the Church Fathers, and strikingly closer to the Jewish canon preserved by Flavius Josephus. It is no exaggeration to say that, in method and in conclusions, Theodore stood closer to the rabbis of his time than to the Christian theologians of Alexandria. And that point did not go unnoticed. When, more than a century later, the Second Council of Constantinople condemned Theodore, one of the specific accusations was that he had interpreted the Psalms in the Jewish manner, Judaikos. The proximity between the Antiochene method and the rabbinic tradition of Peshat, the pursuit of the text's direct, contextual sense, was not merely an academic observation, it was a weapon.
But Theodore's exegesis did not stop at the Old Testament. His commentaries on the Gospel of John and on the Pauline epistles were equally monumental. The commentary on John survives in full in a Syriac translation, one of the rare cases in which an entire work of Theodore escaped the destruction ordered in 553. In it, Theodore displays the same method: obsessive attention to narrative context, meticulous grammatical analysis, resistance to readings that import meanings from outside the text. His commentary on Galatians and on 9 other Pauline epistles survived in a Latin translation discovered in the 19th century and published by H.B. Sweet at Cambridge between 1880 and 1882. A rediscovery that reopened scholarly interest in Theodore in the English-speaking world. And there were also his catechetical homilies, an extraordinary set of instructions on the Nicene Creed, the Lord's Prayer, baptism, and the Eucharist, discovered in Syriac by Alphonse Mingana in 1932 and 1933. These texts reveal a Theodore who was pastoral and didactic, concerned with explaining the faith to catechumens, and they show that his intellectual rigor was not academic coldness, but a deep commitment to the truth of what the Church taught. Yet of everything Theodore wrote, nothing had consequences as devastating for his memory as his Christology. And this is where the story begins to grow complicated. The great theological question of the 4th and 5th centuries, the question that divided ancient Christianity more deeply than any other, was this: who is Jesus Christ? More specifically, how do the divine nature and the human nature relate within him? Everyone agreed that Christ was God and man. The disagreement, fierce, violent, capable of shaking empires, was over the how. On one side stood the Alexandrian tradition, led by Cyril of Alexandria, emphasizing the unity of Christ. For Cyril, there was one incarnate nature of the divine word, mia physis tou theou logos sarkomene. Christ's humanity was real, but wholly absorbed into the identity of the eternal Word. The one who acted, suffered, and died on the cross was God himself incarnate. Mary was therefore Theotokos, Mother of God, because the one she bore was the divine Word in human flesh. On the other side stood the Antiochene tradition, with Theodore as its most articulate representative, insisting on the distinction between the two natures. Theodore argued that Christ possessed a complete divine nature and a complete human nature, with a body, a rational soul, and a proper will. He developed this position in direct response to Apollinaris of Laodicea, who denied that Christ had a complete human mind. For Theodore, to deny Christ's full humanity was to destroy the very logic of salvation. If Christ did not assume a complete human mind, then the human mind was not redeemed. Up to this point, his reasoning was defensible, and many modern theologians argue it was correct. The problem lay in the way Theodore described the union between the two natures. Theodore used the language of indwelling by good pleasure, eudokia. The divine Word dwelt in Christ's humanity as God dwells in a temple, not by essence, not by nature, but by a deliberate act of divine will. This indwelling was unique in degree, incomparable to any other presence of God in prophets or saints. Theodore insisted on that. But the temple analogy suggested to his critics that there were two separate subjects in Christ. The divine Word on one side, the man Jesus on the other, united by a divine decision, but not fused into a single ontological identity. Theodore tried to address this with the concept of a prosopon koinon, a common person or shared identity formed by the conjunction of the two natures. He used analogies: husband and wife who become one flesh, body and soul forming a single human being. But these analogies, however carefully developed, never satisfied the Alexandrian tradition. For Cyril and his followers, what Theodore described was not true unity. It was an association, a partnership, a cooperation between two distinct beings wearing the same garment. And there was the question of Mary. Theodore initially rejected the title Theotokos, Mother of God, arguing that Mary gave birth to the man in whom the Word dwelt, and that the more precise title would be Anthropotokos, Mother of the man, or, as a concession, Christotokos, Mother of Christ. Under pressure, he partially retreated, accepting that Theotokos could be used in a qualified sense. But the damage was done. The rejection of Theotokos would become the battle flag of the entire conflict that was about to unfold, because someone was watching. Someone who absorbed Theodore's Christology, carried it onto the most powerful stage in the Christian world, and shattered everything. His name was Nestorius. The chain of theological transmission was clear as crystal. Diodore of Tarsus formed Theodore of Mopsuestia. Theodore, in turn, directly or indirectly, formed Nestorius. When Nestorius became Patriarch of Constantinople in 428, the same year Theodore died, he carried the entire Antiochene Christology with him. And when he began publicly preaching against the use of the title Theotokos for Mary, he provoked the fury of Cyril of Alexandria and triggered a crisis that would culminate in the Council of Ephesus in 431 and the formal condemnation of Nestorianism. The irony cuts deep. Theodore died in 428 as a respected, orthodox, unassailable man. His student, or intellectual heir, detonated the theological bomb only months later. And once the dust settled, Nestorius's enemies began hunting for the roots. The trail led straight back to Theodore. Cyril of Alexandria wrote Contra Diodorum et Theodorum, a direct attack on the teacher and the teacher's teacher. Rabula of Edessa, a bishop who had converted to Cyril's camp, ordered Theodore's writings to be burned. Only 4 years after his death, the reputation destruction machine began to turn. But it would still take more than a century to finish its work. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, in the Persian Empire, beyond Constantinople's reach, Theodore's work found refuge. Translated into Syriac, his commentaries became the theological foundation of the school of Edessa, and, after that institution was forcibly closed in 489, of the school of Nisibis, the greatest intellectual center of Eastern Syriac Christianity. There, in Mesopotamia, far from the imperial councils, Theodore was not a heretic. He was Mephiskana, the interpreter, the supreme title, the only exegete in the history of Syriac Christianity ever to receive that honor. In every commentary produced within the tradition of the Church of the East, it was enough to say, "The interpreter says," without first name, without surname, and everyone knew exactly who was meant. More extraordinary still, Theodore composed one of the 3 anaphoras, Eucharistic prayers, used in the East Syriac Rite, the Kudasha Demar Theodoros Mpashkana. The Eucharistic liturgy of Theodore, the interpreter, is still celebrated today by the Assyrian Church of the East for roughly 1/3 of the liturgical year, from Advent to Palm Sunday. A man condemned as a heretic by 2/3 of Christendom has his prayer repeated weekly at altars that never recognize that condemnation. A saint to some, a heretic to others. And at that moment, in the mid-5th century, the 2 versions of Theodore began to harden, one in the Syriac East, which revered him, and the other in the Roman imperial world, which increasingly saw him as the poisonous root of the entire Nestorian problem. The question is, how did this silent tension become a posthumous trial? The answer involves an emperor obsessed with control, an empress with her own theological sympathies, a pope too weak to resist, and a palace intrigue so tortuous it feels like fiction. To understand what happened to Theodore after he was dead, you first have to understand the world that existed 125 years after him. The Eastern Roman Empire in the mid-6th century was ruled by a man who refused to be merely an emperor. Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565, wanted to be everything: legislator, builder, conqueror, and theologian. He reformed the Roman legal code, reconquered territories in Africa, Italy, and Hispania, raised Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years, and with the same ambition with which he commanded armies, he decided he could settle the theological disputes that had been tearing his empire apart for more than a century. Because the empire was cracked, and the crack had a name: Chalcedon. The Council of Chalcedon, held in 451, had defined that Christ exists in 2 natures, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. It was a compromise formula, designed to accommodate both the Alexandrian emphasis on Christ's unity and the Antiochene insistence on distinguishing the natures. But the compromise did not work. A vast portion of Eastern Christendom, in Egypt, Syria, Armenia, Ethiopia, rejected Chalcedon as an unacceptable concession to Nestorianism. For these Christians, known as Monophysites, the 2 natures formula was a betrayal of the faith of Cyril of Alexandria. Christ had one nature, divine and incarnate, and any language that divided that unity was heresy. Justinian could not ignore the Monophysites. They represented millions of subjects in the richest and most strategic provinces of the empire: Egypt, Constantinople's breadbasket, and Syria, the commercial corridor to Persia and the Silk Road. Losing the loyalty of these populations was not merely a religious problem. It was a geopolitical threat. The Sasanian Persian Empire watched every internal fissure in Rome with predatory interest, and the Monophysites, feeling persecuted by the imperial Chalcedonian orthodoxy, were vulnerable to co-optation. There was also a more intimate pressure. Empress Theodora, Justinian's wife, his de facto co-ruler, one of the most powerful women in ancient history, had deep Monophysite sympathies. She sheltered Monophysite monks inside the imperial palace itself, corresponded with Monophysite leaders, and pressed her husband relentlessly to make theological concessions that would reconcile the dissidents. The marriage of Justinian and Theodora was, among many other things, a microcosm of the empire's Christological division, an officially Chalcedonian emperor and a secretly Monophysite empress, ruling together over a Christendom split down the middle.
It was in this context that Justinian formed his strategy. The logic was ingenious, and, to his critics, cynical. If the Monophysites rejected Chalcedon because they believed the council was too favorable to Nestorianism, then the solution was to prove that Chalcedon was compatible with Cyril's theology. And the best way to prove that was to condemn the most extreme representatives of the two natures position, the theologians the Monophysites hated most. Destroying Antiochene icons would be the goodwill gesture that would bring the Monophysites back into the imperial fold. And who were those icons? 3 targets, 3 names, 3 chapters, in the Latin sense of capitula, that is, items of condemnation. The first chapter, the person and all the works of Theodore of Mopsuestia. The second, the anti-Cyrillian writings of Theodoret of Cyrus, an Antiochene theologian who had attacked Cyril during the Nestorian controversy, but later reconciled and was accepted by the Council of Chalcedon. The third, the letter of Ibas of Edessa to Maris, a document that praised Theodore and criticized Cyril, whose author had also been rehabilitated at Chalcedon. It was a calculated move. Theodoret and Ibas had been acquitted at Chalcedon. Condemning them now meant, in practice, revising the very council Justinian claimed to defend. But Theodore was the easiest target. He had never been formally tried by any council. He had been dead for more than a century, and he had no living allies powerful enough to defend him. He was the perfect sacrifice. But history has layers that even Justinian could not control. And here enters a character who turns this narrative from political tragedy into palace thriller. His name was Theodore Acidus, bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, and leader of the Origenist faction at the imperial court. Origenism was another controversial theological current, heir to Origen of Alexandria, teaching doctrines such as the pre-existence of souls and the universal salvation of all beings, even demons. Justinian had begun persecuting the Origenists around 543. Theodore Acidus, feeling threatened, needed a distraction. And he found a brilliant one. According to sources such as Evagrius Scholasticus, Liberatus of Carthage, and Domitian of Ancyra, it was Acidus who suggested to Justinian the condemnation of the 3 chapters, not out of theological zeal against Nestorianism, but to divert the emperor's attention away from the persecution of the Origenists. And there was a personal bonus. Theodore of Mopsuestia had written extensively against Origen. His lost treatise against the Allegorists, in 5 volumes, was a frontal assault on Origenist method and doctrine. Condemning Theodore was, for Acidus, an intellectual revenge, the greatest enemy of the allegorical school being destroyed by an allegorist. The irony is almost unbearable. The man who fought hardest against the allegorization of the Bible was condemned in part through the intrigue of an allegorist protecting his own school. Between late 543 and early 544, Justinian issued an imperial edict condemning the 3 chapters. This was not a suggestion, it was an order. All the Eastern patriarchs were compelled to sign. Menas, Patriarch of Constantinople, signed under pressure. The patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem also yielded, some reluctantly, others with enthusiasm. The West remained, and the West refused. Western bishops immediately saw what was at stake. Condemning Theodore and reopening the decisions concerning Theodoret and Ibas would, in practice, weaken the authority of the Council of Chalcedon, the council the West regarded as the cornerstone of Christological orthodoxy. If an emperor could retroactively annul conciliar decisions to please a political faction, then no council was safe. And there was an even more disturbing principle. Condemning a man who died in the Church's communion without ever being judged in life would set a frightening precedent. If Theodore could be condemned
125 years after his death, who would be safe? The bishop who embodied this resistance was Pope Vigilius. Vigilius's relationship with Justinian is one of the most tortuous in papal history. Vigilius was not a man of unshakable principle. Ancient sources suggest he reached the papacy with the help of Empress Theodora, possibly in exchange for promises to support the Monophysite cause. But once seated in Peter's chair, Vigilius discovered that yielding to Constantinople had a price the West was not willing to pay. Justinian summoned Vigilius to Constantinople. The Pope resisted. Then the emperor did not ask. He ordered. In 545, Vigilius was taken to the imperial capital, not as a guest, but essentially as a political prisoner, disguised as an honored visitor. Upon arrival, Vigilius tried to assert his authority. He excommunicated Patriarch Menas for signing the condemnation of the 3 chapters without consulting Rome. Menas retaliated by removing the Pope's name from the diptychs, the liturgical lists symbolizing communion between the churches. It was an open rupture between Rome and Constantinople. Under crushing pressure, Vigilius yielded for the first time. In 548, he issued the Judicatum, a document condemning the 3 chapters while attempting to preserve Chalcedon's authority through careful qualifications. The Western reaction was explosive. The bishops of Africa revolted. The Bishop of Carthage did something nearly unimaginable. He excommunicated the Pope himself. The entire ecclesiastical province of North Africa broke communion with Rome. Faced with rebellion, Vigilius retreated and withdrew the Judicatum. Justinian, enraged, decided to settle the matter once and for all. He called an ecumenical council, the Second Council of Constantinople, for May 553. 164 bishops were gathered. The overwhelming majority were Eastern, loyal to the emperor. The West was almost unrepresented, and the Pope refused to participate. What followed was one of the most dramatic episodes in ecclesiastical history. Vigilius, still in Constantinople, took refuge in the Basilica of St. Peter in the city, invoking the right of sacred asylum. Imperial guards were sent to seize him. According to contemporary reports, the soldiers tried to drag the Pope out by force. Vigilius clung to the altar columns so tightly that the columns themselves began to give way. The scene, an elderly Pope gripping an altar while imperial soldiers tried to tear him away, was so scandalous that the guards backed off, fearing the altar would collapse on everyone. The watching crowd was horrified. Vigilius fled a second time, crossed the Bosporus, and took refuge in the church of St. Euphemia in Chalcedon, the very site where the Council of 451 had met. The choice was symbolic and deliberate. The Pope sheltered himself in the very sanctuary that represented the orthodoxy he claimed to defend. On May 14, 553, cornered but still resisting, Vigilius issued his Constitutum, an extraordinary document in which he rejected 60 propositions drawn from Theodore's writings, yet categorically refused to condemn Theodore's person or his memory. The distinction was crucial. Vigilius accepted that some of Theodore's ideas were problematic, but he denied that the Church had the right to condemn posthumously a man who died in full ecclesiastical communion and was never formally accused in life. It was a defense of a principle that if violated would have no limit. The council ignored Vigilius. In its 7th session, the bishops removed the Pope's name from the diptychs, effectively declaring that the Bishop of Rome was outside the communion of the universal Church, and they proceeded with the condemnation. The 14 anathemas pronounced against Theodore of Mopsuestia were devastating. They did not confine themselves to his ideas. They condemned his person, his memory, and his entire literary work. The council ordered the complete destruction of his writings. Every Greek manuscript was to be burned, confiscated, or erased. It was a theological damnatio memoriae. The man was to be made to simply cease to exist in the Church's history. Vigilius resisted for another 6 months, but imprisoned, isolated, without political support, and with failing health, he finally broke. On December 8, 553, he formally accepted the council's decisions. On February 23, 554, he issued a second constitutum, this time explicitly condemning the 3 chapters, contradicting everything he had written only months before. The emperor finally permitted the pope to return to Rome. Vigilius never made it. He died on the return journey in Syracuse, Sicily, in the spring of 555. He never set foot in Rome again. He never saw his city again. A pope who tried to defend a principle was crushed by the imperial machine and died on the road home. A broken man who could save neither himself nor the memory of a theologian dead for 127 years. The condemnation was done. Theodore of Mopsuestia was officially a heretic. His books were to be eliminated from the face of the earth. But the consequences of that decision were only beginning. The order of destruction was carried out with brutal efficiency. In the months and years following the Second Council of Constantinople, the imperial machinery moved to erase Theodore of Mopsuestia from Christian memory. Ecclesiastical libraries were searched. Monasteries received orders to surrender manuscripts. Scribes who had spent decades copying Theodore's commentaries watched their work confiscated and burned. What had been, for more than a century, the most respected exegetical corpus of the Christian East became forbidden material, condemned text, dangerous possession, evidence of heresy. The destruction was nearly total. Of the dozens of biblical commentaries Theodore produced over 36 years in Mopsuestia, only fragments survived in Greek. The treatise against the allegorists, 5 entire volumes devoted to demolishing Origen's method, vanished completely. His letters, known in the Syriac world as the Book of Pearls, were lost. Treatises on the priesthood, on monasticism, on the Holy Spirit, all destroyed. Of the works that once filled 41 catalogued volumes, only one remained in Greek, the commentary on the 12 minor prophets, published by Angelo Mai between 1825 and 1832, nearly 13 centuries after the condemnation. What survived by accident, by translation, or by defiance. The commentary on the Gospel of John escaped because it had already been translated into Syriac around 460, nearly a century before the Council of 553. That translation was in the hands of Christians living beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, in the Sasanian Persian Empire, where Justinian's orders carried no force of law. The commentaries on Galatians and 9 other Pauline epistles survived in a Latin translation that remained hidden and forgotten until it was discovered in the 19th century. The catechetical homilies, those pastoral instructions on the Creed, baptism, and the Eucharist, were found in Syriac by Alphonse Mingana in 1932, in a manuscript that had crossed the centuries in Middle Eastern libraries. But there was one loss that surpasses all the others in sheer dramatic force, and it deserves to be told, because it shows that Theodore's destruction was not a single event in 553, but a process that continued for centuries, reaching into the very heart of the 20th century. In 1905, the Chaldean Archbishop Adi-Shur discovered in a Nestorian monastery in northern Iraq a complete Syriac translation of Theodore of Mopsuestia's treatise De Incarnatione, on the Incarnation. It was an extraordinary discovery. The treatise was the fullest exposition of Theodore's Christology, the very work his accusers had used as their chief evidence against him in 553, yet one that no one in the modern world had read in full, because the Greek original had been destroyed. Shur catalogued the manuscript and planned to publish it. He never could. In 1915, during the massacres of Assyrian and Chaldean Christians by Ottoman forces, in the same period as the Armenian genocide, the manuscript was destroyed. Adi-Shur himself was murdered. Theodore's most important work on the nature of Christ, which had survived 14 centuries hidden in an Iraqi monastery, vanished forever in an act of violence that terribly echoed the destruction Justinian had ordered 1,362 years earlier. The consequences of the condemnation of 553, however, went far beyond the burning of books. The Christian West erupted. The reaction was not merely theological discomfort, it was an institutional rupture that would take decades to heal. Milan and Aquileia, 2 of the most important sees in Italy, broke communion with Rome. The reason was clear: By accepting the posthumous condemnation of the 3 chapters, Pope Vigilius and his successor Pelagius I had, in the view of these bishops, subjected the Church's authority to the emperor's will and weakened the Council of Chalcedon. Aquileia, in particular, maintained its schism for a staggering length of time, 145 years, until 698. For nearly a century and a half, one of the greatest ecclesiastical provinces of the West refused to recognize that Rome had the right to condemn a dead man by order of an emperor. Isidore of Seville, one of the greatest intellectuals of the medieval West, called Justinian a tyrant and persecutor of the Orthodox. Many shared that judgment. The Second Council of Constantinople, though officially recognized as the Fifth Ecumenical Council, remained for centuries the most controversial of them all, the only one in which a pope was explicitly coerced, the only one in which the Bishop of Rome's name was removed from the diptychs in the middle of a conciliar session, and the only one that condemned posthumously a theologian who had never been accused in life. But while the West resisted and then yielded, the Syriac East followed a completely different path. And this is where Theodore's story splits decisively.
In the Persian Empire, the Church of the East, the Eastern Syriac Christian tradition stretching from Mesopotamia to India and China, never recognized the Second Council of Constantinople. For that church, the Roman imperial councils after Ephesus in 431 were irrelevant. Decisions of a foreign power taken under political pressure without legitimate spiritual authority. And Theodore was not a heretic. He was the foundation. A Persian council in 484 had already recognized Theodore as a guardian of the true faith. The school of Nisibis, the great intellectual center of Eastern Syriac Christianity, direct heir of the school of Edessa, taught theology from Theodore's commentaries as though they were secondary scripture. The students of Nisibis did not merely read Theodore, they memorized Theodore. His exegetical method was the method. His Christology was the Christology. His view of how Christ's 2 natures relate was orthodoxy, not heresy. And his liturgy was the liturgy. The Eucharistic anaphora composed by Theodore, the Kudasha de ma Theodoros Mpashkana, continued to be celebrated week after week in churches scattered from Mesopotamia to Kerala. A man whose memory had been officially eradicated in the Roman world had his words repeated in every Eucharist across the entire Eastern Syriac world. The Synod of Gregory I, in 605, was even more explicit. It decreed that no one was permitted to deviate from Theodore's works. This was not a recommendation. It was a formal prohibition against disagreeing with him. The interpreter could not be questioned. Think about what that means. In the year 605, 52 years after Constantinople condemned every word Theodore had written, an entire Christian church decreed that every word he had written was inviolable. The same person, the same body of writings, judged simultaneously as deadly poison by one tradition and as sacred nourishment by another. There is no comparable case in the history of Christianity, perhaps in the history of any religion, and that paradox was never resolved. Not in 605, not in 1000, not in 1500. It remains to this day. What Justinian wanted, to reconcile the Monophysites, failed completely. Monophysite Egypt did not return to the imperial fold. Monophysite Syria remained dissident. The Armenian, Coptic, and Ethiopian churches stayed separated from Chalcedon. The condemnation of the 3 chapters convinced no one who needed convincing, and alienated many who did not need alienating. The Schism of Aquileia lasted nearly a century and a half. The papacy emerged weakened, humiliated, bearing the memory of a pontiff who died on the road home. And the man at the center of it all, Theodore of Mopsuestia, remained a heretic to some and a saint to others, with neither side yielding an inch. The imperial power machine had tried to rewrite history. It had the army, the councils, the bureaucratic apparatus, the authority to burn books and erase names. And even so,
it failed. Because there was something Justinian could not destroy. The Syriac translations already beyond his borders, the Christians who had already memorized the texts, and an entire tradition that refused to accept that truth could be decided by imperial decree. Theodore had been dead for 125 years when he was condemned, but his ideas were more alive than ever, growing in soil no Roman emperor could reach.
15 centuries have passed, and Theodore of Mopsuestia is still on trial. Not in a council, not by imperial decree, but in theology departments at the world's leading universities, in the pages of academic journals, in pulpits of churches he could never have imagined, and, perhaps most revealing of all, in the quiet debates between Christian traditions that still cannot agree on who he really was. The academic rehabilitation of Theodore gained momentum throughout the 20th century and has not slowed down. The central name is Frederick G. MacLeod, a Jesuit priest, professor at Georgetown and St. Louis University, who spent decades showing, publication after publication, that the condemnation of 553 was historically unjustifiable. His argument is precise and devastating. Theodore was judged by theological standards that did not exist during his lifetime. The Christology of Cyril of Alexandria, which became the yardstick by which Theodore was measured, was formulated after Theodore was already dead. To judge an early 5th century theologian by mid-5th century criteria is like condemning an 18th century physician for not using antibiotics. MacLeod's book, Theodore of Mopsuestia, published by Routledge in 2009 in the prestigious Early Church Fathers series, became the definitive reference on the subject in the Anglophone world. Daniel L. Schwartz, a researcher at Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, opened another front by publishing Paideia and Cult in 2013, examining Theodore not as an abstract heresiarch, but as a concrete pastor, a bishop who formed catechumens, celebrated the sacraments, and cared about the theological education of ordinary believers. Justin Lee, in 2022, challenged what he called the outdated paradigm of Antiochene exegesis as purely literal, showing that Theodore possessed a hermeneutical sophistication that manuals of theological history simply ignored for centuries. The Bryn Mawr Classical Review, one of the most respected publications in the classical world, devoted an extensive review to MacLeod's work, signaling that Theodore had moved out of the ghetto of marginal patristic studies and into the center of serious academic debate. But Theodore's rediscovery did not remain confined to the academy. In the United States, evangelical and reformed communities began to claim Theodore as a patristic ancestor of their own method of reading the Bible. The logic is straightforward. If Theodore insisted on the historical grammatical sense of the text, on the intention of the human author, on the original context before any theological application, then he was doing, in the 4th century, exactly what Protestant seminaries teach today as responsible exegesis. An essay in Reformed Perspectives magazine declared bluntly, "We who embrace the historical grammatical method of exegesis are therefore anathematized by this council." The Masters Seminary blog, one of the most influential institutions in conservative American Protestantism, published an article with the provocative title, "How an Ancient Heretic Can Help You Read the Bible." The Center for Baptist Renewal and the Alliance Baptist Theological Seminary include Theodore in their surveys of historical hermeneutics. This evangelical appropriation of Theodore is fascinating because it creates an unlikely alliance. 21st century American conservative Protestants defending a 4th century bishop condemned by the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodoxy. The common enemy is uncontrolled allegory, and the common hero is a man who said 1600 years ago that the biblical text means what it says before it can mean anything else. There is still a third stream of rediscovery, more unexpected and potentially more controversial. Christian Universalist communities discovered that Theodore taught that divine punishment was restorative, not eternal. Theodore argued that the wicked would be punished
until they learned that, by persisting in sin, they were only prolonging their own suffering, a position that implies hell has an end, and that divine punishment has a pedagogical purpose, not a vindictive one. Websites such as salvationforall.org and tentmaker.org present Theodore as one of the earliest defenders of universal restoration. The irony is that this aspect of his theology, universalism, was not the reason he was condemned. What destroyed him was his Christology. Yet it is universalism that draws a new generation of readers in the 21st century. On the Jewish and Israeli side, the connection remains academic, but deeply significant. Mark Hirschman, of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, published A Rivalry of Genius in 1995, comparing rabbinic midrashic exegesis with patristic interpretation, a study that touches directly on the parallel between Theodore's method and the Jewish tradition of Peshat. Maron R. Niehoff, also of the Hebrew University and a member of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, leads the Romana project, funded by the European Research Council through 2029, comparing Jewish, Christian, and pagan intellectual traditions in late antiquity. Mordecai Z. Cohen, of Yeshiva University in New York, published The Rule of Peshat in 2020, tracing how Jewish interpretation by the plain sense emerged in dialogue with Christian literal exegesis. Research developed in part during a fellowship at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. Theodore's name appears in these conversations as a constant presence, yet still not fully explored. A dedicated comparative study between Theodore's hermeneutics and rabbinic Peshat remains an obvious academic gap, one that Israeli institutions are well positioned to fill.
And perhaps the most significant development of all happened not in a university, but in an ecclesiastical meeting room. In 1994, Pope John Paul II and Patriarch Mardinka IV, leader of the Assyrian Church of the East, the very church that venerates Theodore as the interpreter, signed the Common Christological Declaration. In that document, the two churches affirmed that they confess the same faith in the Son of God, despite using different terminologies. What that meant in practice was that the Christological tradition founded by Theodore of Mopsuestia, the same tradition condemned in 553 as heretical, could after all be within the boundaries of orthodoxy. Sebastian Brock, the greatest living Syriacist, argued in a 2024 study published in the journal Religions that the Church of the East's Christology represents one of the 5 legitimate Christological positions of the ancient Church, and that the label Nestorian is, in his words, wholly misleading and incorrect. Think about the weight of that claim. A pope recognized that Theodore's theological tradition expresses the same Christian faith. One of the world's leading scholars declared that the condemnation rested on a false label. Protestant seminaries teach him as a pioneer of the method they use every day. Scholars at Harvard, Georgetown, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem study his work with growing respect. And his Eucharistic liturgy is still celebrated today in churches stretching from Iraq to southern India. But formally, officially, Theodore of Mopsuestia remains condemned. Neither the Catholic Church nor Eastern Orthodoxy has revoked the anathemas of 553. The man who was the greatest Bible scholar of his generation, who was never accused in life, who died in full communion with the Church, remains, in the official records, a heretic, a saint to some, a heretic to others. And the distance between those two verdicts is not theological, it is political.
Now tell me, if a man can be saint and heretic at the same time, depending only on which church door you walk through, who really decides what is true? Reflect, comment, share.